pairs of white and people of color applicants into these fine dining restaurants to see who would get hired. So they were white and people of color folks that looked, so we tried to make them look exactly as close to each other as we could. That city was one of the sectors. Sitting this tall, 6-foot African man is paired with a equally tall white man, and they had to spend time like mimicking each other and learning each other's personalities so that when they walked into the restaurant, there was absolutely no other factor that could emerge from why they were treated differently than their race. And of course, so many times, the white man would walk into the restaurant and be hired on the spot, and cities would be told over and over again, we're not hiring now, we're not hiring now. And that happened over and over again. The reports coming out of January that 225 different pairs, City was among them. But we also just went out to restaurants and counted how many white people were in the front and how many people of color were in the back. Well, I tell you this because partly you'll read the report in January, but also because now we've gone national. Now but they're also kind of beginning to interact with the global restaurant workers movement, and that really has to be the solution to everything we're talking about. It has to be about developing international labor standards and developing international worker solidarity around the world. And that sounds so cliche and like old school, but there are new and creative ways of doing things here, which I think Ross is among. But there are really amazing and creative things that are happening around the world as well that we are beginning to enforce. And that's we've been in talks with restaurant workers in England and in Canada, but most recently we got to meet with the Restaurant Workers Union in Mexico, thanks to Tidra Francis. And so we met with them and we actually asked them, so do you ever have this problem where they hire the white people in the front and we find out in restaurants in Mexico City and the darker skinned Mexicans in the back? And they said, well, actually, we never really had that issue before. I don't know how much. Well, they said we never really had that issue before, but more recently, all these American corporations have started to come into Mexico City and themselves and set up restaurants, and usually they come in and the first thing they say is, could we have a tall, white-skinned Mexican working in front of the house? And they ask for that when they come, and it's become a problem. And what this means is that globalization is not just about exporting horrible jobs and exporting exploitation. It's also about exporting our very unique American racism. We are globalizing American racism. And not to say that these countries didn't have their own issues of skin color. I come from a country that's obsessed with skin color, obsessed with skin color, but there is a very unique American racism that we are exporting. And what is the response to that? It's globalizing racial justice and importing racial and economic justice and importing amazing ideas. So, for example, with our cooperative, importing the idea of a worker-owned restaurant that actually could go to scale, that's owned by people of color and immigrants, importing the idea of worker solidarity, which happens in a lot of other places around the world, and it's kind of new to us, the idea of really learning from and working with people from around the world. But what it means for us in the long term, very practically, and I just want to end with this because I feel the need to have practical solutions, not just talk big. So practical solution. One, a campaign where universally we refuse to allow lighter-skinned folks to work in the front-of-the-house jobs, right? Universally, we stand in solidarity with the workers in Mexico, and together we fight the same corporations. We're starting to do this, the same restaurant companies that are asking for this kind of hierarchy. That's one. But two, that we even think beyond our own silos, as was said this morning. So we've created a new alliance of workers up and down the food chain. Farm workers, meat and poultry processing workers, food retail and distribution workers, supermarket workers, and restaurant workers. And one of the groups in the alliance is an international food workers group that, is working with farm workers in Africa and Latin America. Because we know that the food system is international. We know that our food comes from elsewhere and ends up on our table in the fancy fine dining restaurant, but the labor is not talking to each other. And so we created this alliance particularly bring us together and ultimately impact the food system. So now like Slow Food Nation, and we say, as long as you're thinking about sustainable and local food, let's talk about sustainable labor conditions, because you're never, ever going to have sustainable food systems without alternative and locally grown. Nobody's ever going to be able to afford them if none of us have good wages, and that's the last thing going to end up on. We want some economic stimulus. Let's raise the minimum wage, because there's no